This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. Most musicians tour in a van, but not Ben Weaver. The bicycle is his mode of transportation. With custom bike bags for his guitar and banjo, Ben has toured 1,500 miles from St. Paul to New Orleans, and recently spent 16 days cycling 1,400 miles around Lake Superior for his Surrounding Water tour. In addition to his 8 studio albums, he has published 4 books of poetry, and he partners with organizations to help raise awareness around water and land issues. You can learn more about Ben at his website, benweaver.net. Ben Weaver, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Before you started touring by bike, how long were you touring by automobile?
Well, I started playing music, amateur professionally when I was about 19, and my approach was to just go everywhere and play anywhere that I could. Let's see, that would have been like 2001, I think, or 2000. So I had about 13 years of, touring in cars and vans and other sorts of gasoline-powered transportation before I decided to start pedaling.
So, Ben, what motivated you to stop the gasoline-powered transportation and start touring by bike?
It wasn't really about gasoline to begin with. It was mostly just really an unhealthy lifestyle, and knowing that I needed to do something different, wanted to do something different, to be out in closer connection with the landscape. I felt that a lot of my music was inspired by the land, my time outside in the woods, which is where I spent a lot of my time when I wasn't touring. And I reached a moment, I think, in my internal philosophy where it started to feel disingenuous to be writing about the natural world and then having no connection to that world when I was actually doing my job, which was performing the songs that I wrote. I have always been an avid cyclist and a commuter, and decided, I wonder what would happen if I just attempted riding to shows. So I began doing that just in town in the Twin Cities. So that obviously wasn't super complicated. And then I started planning little trips around the Midwest. I've always been, a pretty strong rider. So I thought I can do 100 miles and play a show. So I sort of built these routes around, where can I ride at 2 and 100 miles and play. So after doing that for a while, I felt pretty confident and that I could do and wanted to do longer trips. So that's when I, kind of moved on to the, I guess you could call it, more expedition touring.
I also read that in addition to changing the way that you tour, you've also changed the venues that you play at. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, well, that happened pretty naturally as soon as I started realizing that I didn't want to just ride to the same venues that I had been playing at previously. And this happened when I started realizing that I wanted the music and the performances to also benefit and raise awareness about the land and water that I was singing about in my songs and that inspired me in life in general. So like when I rode down the Mississippi, I started looking at different river groups or nature centers or different organizations that were in some way affiliated with the river, and then talk to them about partnering and doing a performance. So just by virtue of speaking to these different groups, then we were using, in some cases, schools or more public type settings like parks, libraries, and sometimes still then those groups wound up supporting and promoting the show, but we would use a music venue. So that's sort of how that evolved.
How would you describe your music and your poetry?
Well, the younger, sort of more punk rock side of me always said, that's not my job. I just let the people who listen to it describe it. And I still pretty much believe that, because I think part of the job of art any art is that it needs to inspire and cause somebody some sort of action, even if that action is just to think about or to consider, what is this about? And then to decide for themselves what it connects to in their own personal story and experience and what they relate to about it. And I believe really strongly in that. And so I guess that is what my music is about, is hopefully inspiring people to ask questions and feel connected to something outside of their daily routine.
Sure. Nobody really likes to be put in a box, I guess. But yeah, I'll just describe it by one word because I was thinking about it. I would just call it Americana. So if you like that style of music, I think you would like Ben's music. So you should go check it out. All right, let's talk about the St. Paul to New Orleans trip. How did you get the idea for this tour?
It's a good story, and it's a quick one, actually. A very good friend of mine who was a journalist and was living in New York, we had been talking about doing a trip together for a long time. And he had a dream one night that he rode his bicycle to New Orleans with me and he quit smoking. And so at that time, I was trying to figure out what my first sort of, long extended trip would be. And when he called me and told me about that dream, I said, all right, well, that's what I'm going to do. So I'd been doing quite a bit of work with the river through a local group called Wilderness Inquiry. I was leading some canoe trips with youth during the summertime, and I've lived very close to the river for close to 8 years now. So it just seemed like a really good first trip and really relevant because the whole nature of the work was about connecting things, and the rivers that's what rivers are all about. So
tell me a little bit about the bike that you're riding on this adventure, and then I want to learn a little bit more about how you have it outfitted.
So I've been riding a lot of different bikes. I work with Salsa Cycles. I'm a sponsored rider for them. So when I went on that trip, I took a Salsa Via, which is just a steel frame. It's a steel frame bicycle, but kind of a cross between maybe like a road touring steel rig and a little more of a gravel geometry, and pretty nimble bike, super fun. I carry my guitar and banjo on the rear luggage rack, so I joke that it looks like I have two smokestacks. And one of my other partners, Banjo Brothers, they made me a custom pannier to carry the banjo in with a waterproof cover. I don't take a whole lot because I don't need a whole lot, so I just pack my clothes and things around the instruments and in the extra space in the panniers.
I'm curious to learn a little more about how the custom bags came about. Did you go to Banjo Brothers and approach them with the idea, or how did the whole process work?
It's just funny that they're called Banjo Brothers, and one of my main instruments is a banjo, and that none of them play banjos. So there's just some kind of funny irony there. But I don't know, we were just talking about how I'd been doing it up until that point, because I'd been using an Ortlieb that I had and my banjo fit in. And one of the guys was like, well, why don't we just have Eric, make something that is a little bit more custom for the banjo. And it just happened pretty organically.
On your tour to New Orleans, how many miles are you riding a day? And second part of the question is about how much time do you need to rest up before you perform a show?
When I rode to New Orleans, that was really kind of a unique trip because my riding partner, Johnny Miles, who came with me, who also was writing about the trip for Bicycling Magazine, the most he'd ever ridden a bike in his life was 40 miles. So this was everything about this was new to him. He'd never toured before. He'd been on one supported kind of sightseeing tour that it was a journalism project that he'd done where they shuttle your gear ahead in a van or something, and you stay at a bed and breakfast. So we started with 60 miles a day, and then the mileage towards the end, the second half, was more like 80 to 100 because I knew he'd be strong at that point and more used to what we were doing. Plus it would be flatter. I love riding my bike so much, and I've spent so much time outside and so much time on my bike over the years that in the rare case where we had really bad weather or just something was challenging and I might have needed a few minutes to gather myself. I tried to plan a couple hours just so that we could have some transition time and eat. But there were definitely some longer days of riding where we showed up and literally unloaded the bike, ate some food, and then I started to perform. And so that's never been a problem for me either.
What's the fallback, or what's the contingency plan? Like, say you're running really late, what do you do?
Well, thankfully now I've done 3 big tours. I've done the New Orleans, the Lake Superior, and then I did a section of the Pacific Northwest last fall. And I've never been late to a show. So my contingency plan is to plan ahead and, to do a good job with my routing and with my daily planning. And I'm sure at some point in this, something will happen, that will be unforeseeable, but I try to do as much of that on the front end so that I've got, the time I need built in to get to where I need to go so that I don't have to be late.
Are you a map guy on paper, or do you like GPS?
I've always been, I'm kind of a Luddite for the most part. So I've always just really firmly believed in the state highway map folded up kind of a thing. But lately because of some of the stuff I've been working on, I've been learning more about how to use my GPS and ride with GPS, that program, and building my own routes and stuff. And I have to say I'm getting kind of excited and might be heading towards a conversion. I'll always have a paper map with me, and I'll probably use that a lot, but I see real advantages to both, given, depending on what situation you're in.
Do you usually perform solo, or do you oftentimes tour and meet up and do things with other musicians?
It's kind of a mixture, but for sure, since I've been performing by bike and doing this work, it's largely been solo. I have one friend specifically, his name's Mike Munson, who's a really phenomenal guitar player. And he's expressed a little bit of interest in traveling by bike. So he did a couple of the New Orleans show, like the Wisconsin leg. He tagged along for 4 or 5 days and played shows with me. I've been performing solo so much that I've been a little more interested in working on maybe bringing some people along and trying to figure that out and asking myself the questions. Like, just the reality is that most musicians don't ride bikes. And if they do, they don't ride bikes 100 miles a day and play a show. So finding somebody whose musical taste would overlap with mine and skill set, we're talking like probably a fairly uncommon individual. So I'd love to meet some of those people at some point. But in the meantime, I've been asking myself the question of, well, if I ride, am I okay with somebody else driving if I decide I want to play with people more? So kind of working on that, right now.
How do you get the word out about your performances?
Well, some of it is just, the traditional way that musicians let people know about their shows through the website and social media. But a lot of it's been, I feel like one of the more successful aspects to my reinvention of myself, I guess, has been when I'm partnering with a group, like when I rode around Lake Superior, I worked with a group in Marquette, Michigan called Save the Wild UP. So when they're hosting a performance, then, everybody in that group is hearing about it and they're interested because I'm supporting their cause and I'm bringing awareness to what they're doing and what they're already interested in. So there's a lot of crossover. And then the media is interested in it, especially if it's in a small town. There's not often a lot going on. So for somebody to be coming through on a bicycle, carrying their instruments, doing the work that I'm doing, then that is, something that people get excited about. So I've kind of just let it take itself, but I've learned some lessons on what are some obvious channels to increase the awareness about what I'm doing.
Just quickly back to a question about your kit. Do you bring along a full camping setup, or do you mostly find that you're able to do like the couch surfing thing from night to night?
It's kind of a mixture. Like when we were in New Orleans, it was obviously, or headed to New Orleans, we were in more, like we were just in towns every night. So it was a lot easier to stay with people. And I didn't mind that. When I went around Lake Superior, like half the shows I did were at parks, either state parks or provincial parks. So I was just camping. And so for that trip, I carried all my camping gear and tent, sleeping bag, sleeping pad, stove. But the food is the easy part because I was always performing. So there was usually there was at least one meal as a part of that. So I didn't have to cook quite as much as if I was just straight up bike camping.
I want to transition into this Lake Superior tour, but before I do, I wanted to read part of a quote I pulled off of your blog. Do you mind?
Sure, go ahead.
It says, my ride around Superior was incredible. I saw the landscape change, met incredible people, rode close to the weather, lived how I am happiest, down on the bones of life. I love that phrase, down on the bones of life. What does that mean?
It's funny to hear you read that because it's great. You asked me before, what is my music? What kind of music do I make? Or, and I sort of avoided answering that question. And one of the reasons I did is because a lot of this work I feel of being an artist, I don't feel any ownership towards it. I feel like, I think Mick Jagger said it's like writing a song. It's like standing in a river and trying to catch a fish. And I feel like I'm this doorway. So I totally forgot about that, what you just read, and even that line, because I feel like it's more about a vulnerability that I've learned to open myself up to, and then it passes through me. I guess what I meant by that, though, is when you're out there on any kind of a trip, and I do believe that even just a commute to work can be a trip, you're dealing with sort of the bare bones of necessity of what it means to be human. Like, you need to be dressed properly so that you're not cold and you're not too hot. You need to have the right nutrition. You need to have whether it's, you're skiing or biking or whatever it is that you're doing, like the mechanics of that need to be dialed and figured out and maintained. And it's very primitive, So I feel like being down on the bones in life is just, there's just not any excess. There's nothing superfluous. You just you have what you need and you're close to what that means. And I feel like for me, that's where I find the most inspiration and vitality of life is in circumstances where that's how I'm operating.
What was your main goal with the ride around Lake Superior?
I don't think I really knew what it was until I was almost done with that trip. And I think what I learned along the way was that trip was part of me sort of verbally processing my work in a way. I don't have a business plan where I say, okay, I make these kinds of shirts and I sell them to these people. And so in order to do that, here's what I'm going to do. What's always been important to me is to do work that feels meaningful, that I love, and that makes me happy. And so going on these long bike trips, that's why I was doing them. But I realized when I was on that trip that another thing that I was doing that I had no idea I was doing when I planned them was that I was connecting people to their own landscapes and to parts of themselves that they had felt disconnected to. So that sort of becoming aware of that is now sort of my goal going forward with my trips, is to recognize that all people have this inherent sense of wonder and creativity, and that my trips and my work is really about honoring and inspiring that and helping others, including myself, stay connected to those parts of our hearts and our minds.
If I'm not mistaken, you were touring for a new album that you have out called I Would Rather Be a Buffalo. And I was wondering, why did you name it that?
Well, I've always loved bison, and they are an incredible animal, and an animal like in the land's heritage that is so important and is gone now for the most part. that I think, we don't really have prairie anymore. And one of the main reasons is because we don't have buffalo anymore. But specifically, that title came from the fact that I had taken a brief stint to but working in a kitchen, I guess as a chef, to some extent, you would say, from music for a while before I reached the kind of, I'm going to ride my bicycle to shows now, and that's what I'm going to do. And that cooking kind of evolved into this making charcuterie and butchering pigs. And I remember I'd been inside, we were working these 10-hour days in this kitchen with no windows. And I was washing dishes at the end of the day, and a friend called me and asked how I was doing. And I said, I'd rather be a buffalo, because it was like a beautiful windy day in the summer. And I just thought had been thinking about a herd of bison just standing out in a field, being able to experience the weather. And that's what I was longing for at that time. And I just remember saying, that's a good line. So I wrote it down, and then the buffalo kept coming up. It's in a lot of the songs on that record. There's a lot of references and images hinted at. So it just seemed to make sense. And then I guess it does make sense because that feeling that I had of being inside but wanting to be outside really informed my choice making. And I think, the sort of revelations that I had that led to my choices.
You said that you wrote it down. Do you keep like a little notepad with you to jot down ideas when you have them?
Yeah, I've kept a little notebook in my back pocket for, many years. So yeah, a lot of those little fragments, as I like to call them, that's where they end up.
I'm curious as to the types of people that come to your shows, and more specifically, I guess this is sort of the flip side of the question is, do you ever have anybody there that disagrees with your message or the types of water and land issues that you're trying to support?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely something that when I went around Lake Superior, I was more concerned with the idea that there would be people who disagreed, because I got a lot more publicity for it. The trip down the Mississippi was more of a trip, while there was like conservation aspects and, trying to connect and talk about the river with people. I just hadn't developed as much of my message as I did when I went around Lake Superior. I think that was also one of the more inspiring aspects to that trip too, was that I didn't meet anybody, but it wasn't because I was only talking. It was only because I was preaching to the choir. I think there were two things that kind of happened. And one of them was that I really saw this in Canada, where I performed in the provincial parks. And so when I did that, the people who came to the show were the people camping in those parks, and the people camping in those parks on any given day, it's a very diverse group of people with diverse backgrounds from all over the world, or, at least all over North America. And there were definitely people there who, if we had sat down and talked about who are you voting for or whatever, to make it really literal, we wouldn't have necessarily agreed. But my message is, it's important that my message is not about, here's what's wrong and here's what you should do, or these are all the bad people and these are all the good people and I'm with the good people. I think, for example, even talking about mining, I've been somewhat involved with Save the Boundary Waters, which is, working to make sure that there's no mining that happens that would impact the watershed up in the Boundary Waters. And in spending time in Ely, and understanding there's a lot of misunderstanding between the people who would be for the mining and who would be opposed to it. And what I see is that those people have a lot more in common than they have different. It's just not understanding each other's stories or histories. And so I'm much more interested in being a listener in that situation, or trying to encourage some sort of sharing or connection. So I feel like because my goal is connectivity, I've had really positive results.
Ben, what do you find to be the most challenging aspects of touring on a bike?
I think the fact that you can only go as fast as you can go. being out on the road and having a place that I need to be at a certain time. And as I said earlier, I've never missed a show or been late for a show. There have definitely been times where I'm riding into a headwind and it's hot and I'm going slower than I want to go, and I'm pushing my boundary for where I need to be. And it's frustrating, because in a car you can just press down for harder on the gas, or you can look at a different route that might get you there quicker. And on a bike, you're limited to what you can do. And so that's challenging while also incredibly humbling and inspiring at the same time. So I think, yeah, it's a challenge to come face to face with your limits, whatever they might be.
Let's transition into this Boundary Waters adventure that you talked about. First, though, I want to put in a plug for a previous podcast that I did with Dave and Amy Freeman, this Year in the Wilderness adventure that they're doing out in the Boundary Waters. So you can listen to that at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ198. Ben, how did you come to be involved in this resupply?
Well, I've known, not personally, but I'd known of Dave and Amy for some time because we lived in Grand Marais close to the same time, kind of overlapped a little bit. But I had performed up in Ely, and one of the people involved in the campaign had approached me and said, "Oh, we're doing this." Had basically told me about the trip and asked if I wanted to be involved, and said it sounded great. And then when my summer got over and the fall kind of came around, we just reconnected. And a lot of what it was, though, was me coming up with the idea that I wanted to do a resupply trip that wasn't going to just be taking them more food and supplies, but I wanted to speak to the idea that we need more than just food to survive. And I think sometimes in our daily lives, we get so wrapped up in our to-do lists and making money so that we can buy food and we can keep we can pay our bills, and that we forget about the other things that we need to sustain us. And I think that places like the Boundary Waters, Superior National Forest, the Great Lakes, they offer us this kind of replenishment and these places to go to reflect and slow down and, like I said before, connect to something that is bigger than us. I saw a metaphor there, I guess, and I thought that bringing them a resupply that would include a performance and some kind of, sharing of music and art, and that could also be really inspiring for them and also help. It'd be a unique way to share the message, which I guess was also the point. It's like trying to let as many people know about this issue and what they're doing as possible. And I felt like since it was kind of a unique approach, that we could probably get some attention, which we did because the Current got involved and sent Bill DeVille, one of their DJs, in with me, and they made a video, and it wound up reaching a lot of people. So it was a pretty successful trip.
How long did you stay out there?
We were only in the Boundary Waters with Dave and Amy for a day and a night. So it was a pretty quick trip. I rode from Ely to the entry point at Snowbank Lake, and then left my bike there because you can't take a bicycle in the Boundary Waters. And we trudged across the lake and met them at the wilderness boundary. Went in, hung out for a while, cooked food, and told some stories. And then I did a little show and read them some poems, and hung out a little bit more. And the next morning we got up and had breakfast and went for a little walk, and then headed out back across the lake. So it was a pretty quick visit.
What kind of bike?
I took a Salsa Blackboro, which is a fat bike with 5-inch tires on it.
That worked pretty good?
It did, actually. I mean, when I was going up there, I was thinking, I don't need a fat bike for this trip because there's no snow, and it was warm and it had been raining. But the morning that I woke up, there was like 4 inches of really heavy, wet snow on the ground. And by the time I got out to Snowbank Lake, there was probably close to a foot. So I was pretty thankful that I had chosen that bicycle.
What do you remember as being the most fun part of that resupply?
There was a pretty powerful moment when we were walking back across the lake. The whole thing had been so epic in a way because because of the weather. And when we were walking out across Snowbank Lake to meet them, you couldn't see 100 yards in front of you. So for for a portion of it at least. And, it really felt like you were in a snow globe. And then the next day it was still very kind of post blizzard gray and, but just so still and beautiful. And we walked to the wilderness boundary on the way back and said goodbye to Dave. And we kept walking and he turned around and kept walking. And at a certain point I turned around and I could just barely see him in the distance. And I watched him disappear back into the landscape. And there was just something really powerful about that, because when I had met them the day before and they'd met us at the wilderness boundary, when Dave was approaching, the first thing I smelled wood smoke from like 10 feet away, because they'd been, living in this tent with a wood stove. And I don't know, just how, their physical scent, the physical sense of them was so married to that landscape from having been out there for 6 months. And then when we said goodbye and I watched Dave kind of like melt back into the landscape, it felt very fitting. And that was pretty awesome. Riding in the snow and the physical aspect of pulling sleds across the lake, and that was exciting too. But I think just seeing how we really aren't that far away from being able to live much more simply. It's just that so much of the infrastructure around us encourages this lifestyle that I think unfortunately makes it seem like we're a lot further away from just living in a tent, And so seeing them and seeing how close they were to the landscape was pretty awesome.
What kind of a message do you maybe either give to people at your shows, or that you would want people listening to this to hear?
I think every person has to kind of evaluate for themselves what's important to them and what they want to be a part of and what they don't want to be a part of, and support and not support. But I think that for me, one thing that's been really important is just asking questions and learning as much as you can about everything. And if you're riding bikes at Lebanon Hills and you are looking at that single track, and then you're at Battle Creek, I'm talking about places within the Twin Cities, like there's huge differences between what's happening in those two landscapes, and asking why, and using your own resources to kind of figure that out. Or if you're really interested, talk to someone who builds the trails and ask them, or learn the trees. I think that learning the names of plants, looking at maps, learning the history of rivers, learning about storms, learning about the lakes. I'm not an expert, so I can't really talk about it in depth, but every lake goes through this process of stratification where the water basically changes places from the top to the bottom. And I think there's so many metaphors and so much to be learned from these natural processes. And I think the more that we understand them and the more we look into them, that it starts to inform the way we live our daily lives. So I think that's some of what I try to offer to people. And I just ask questions. I think you learn so much from asking questions and being a listener.
What's the best thing that's happened to you since you've gone through this transformation and changed the way that you tour?
By far, the people that I've been able to meet and the stories that they've told me, and then, in turn, how that's impacted and affected my life and the wisdom that I have access to. I think that's a big part of what I hope for myself and for other people, is, to just have more access to different possibilities and stories for how we can live our lives. And the more that we're out there interacting with people and sharing our story and talking to one another, the more we have access to. And I think that just increases the possibilities, and mine have definitely been increased since I've made the decision to travel this way and to make this evolution of my work.
The wisdom you have access to. I like it. It's a good line. What is the most unexpected thing that's happened to you since the change?
I think becoming like a, how do I say this? Like Salsa calls me their sponsored artist. And so having being an athlete be part of my profession, part of my career, because up until this point, it was only just something that I did. You know, I was a physical person. I always played sports. Being outside, doing active stuff was part of who I was. But now it's also, I'm sponsored rider with and working with Salsa as a bike brand, and I'm a ambassador to Granite Gear, and have relationships with several other brands, which, you know, you kind of associate with professional athlete types. So I don't know that I consider myself a professional athlete, but the kind of being in that world a little more has been really unexpected, but also incredibly awesome. And I've learned a ton. And so I'm super grateful and really excited to see kind of how that part of my career evolves too going forward.
Ben, what's next for you?
Next for me is, well, this weekend we're going up north with the kids to explore on fat bikes and do a little bike packing trip for the weekend. But after that, I'm going to Alaska to do a 10-day fat bike pack raft overland trip on the Kenai Peninsula. Then after that, I have a trip to Europe, and then some little things scattered in and out of there. I'm working on writing a new record and kind of putting together the next, like, you know, the next music bike stewardship adventure for 2017.
Very cool. Are we going to be able to read about that bike pack rafting trip on the Salsa website?
Yeah, we're working on, I can't talk too much about it right now, but we're working on a pretty awesome project for that. So people will have to be a little bit patient, but there's definitely gonna be some sharing of that adventure for sure.
All right, very cool. Ben, how can people contact you if they want to learn more?
The easiest way is just my website. There's a form submission thing there, and you can just email me through my website. And admittedly, that's where you can tell I'm a total Luddite. My website needs a lot of work, but you can listen to my record there. And if anyone wants to see where I'm playing, it's usually updated there and what's going on. I try to update the journal as often as possible, but not often enough.
Ben Weaver, thanks for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and good luck on the Alaska adventure.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Paul.
You're welcome. Recorded June 8th, 2016. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.